Hello and welcome to the new tribal system explained. Leviathan has brought with it a major revamp to the EU4 tribal system. Tribes are now split into two distinct types. Those predominantly in the New World, the pink ones, and those predominantly of the Old World. The pink ones concentrate on North America and Australia, and those of the Old World are predominantly in the steppes, Siberia, Africa, and the Middle East, with a little smattering here and there elsewhere. We will be concentrating on New World tribals, as they are the ones that have received the rework in the Leviathan patch. New World tribals can be migratory or settled. Migration is similar to the old system, but now has a military monarch point cost that scales with the distance the tribe is migrating from their existing tribal land, and which can be further modified by government reforms. But before talking about how settled and migratory tribes differ, let's detail the ways in which they're the same, starting with the tribal land mechanic. Both migratory and settled tribes use the new tribal land system. Tribal land represents land that the tribe considers to be their own, even if they're not actively occupying it at the time. This land can be fought over like a fully colonized province. If the fight is between tribals, the land will remain tribal after the fight. If the fight is between a reformed nation and a tribal, and the reformed nation takes tribal land, it gets immediately turned into a full province, but will need to be caught. When the tribal land of one tag, such as Wichita here, borders that of another, they automatically gain a tribal border feud CB, allowing a war to be declared for such a purpose, as taking tribal land from each other. Non-tribals will generally need to generate claims as normal. Additionally, although tribal land may not be actively used, that doesn't mean that one tribe is happy for another tribe to go poking around in their tribal land. So we show our lands that we consider tribal as here as yellow. It also gets indicated with the fuzzy purple borders that match our normal color purple. If a migratory tribe enters the land of a second tribe, the second tribe will automatically receive a forced migration CB in order to eject the interlopers. In addition to doing so through conflict, both migratory and settled tribes may expand their tribal land through peaceful means, although they do so a little differently from each other. As a migratory tribe migrates, they may add the current province they occupy, if it isn't already tribal land of another nation, to their own land, at a base cost of 100 administrative monarch points, which can be further modified by certain government reforms. This, in combination with the increasing military cost for migrating further and further away from existing tribal land, discourages the migration over large distances without ever adding any land as tribal land, as the military monarch point cost becomes prohibitively expensive. On the other hand, attempting to add literally every province during a migration can result in an admin to military monarch point cost that is 2 to 1, and so likely to become unsustainable. At this point, you may be wondering, why would I even want to fight over tribal land if it doesn't generate income or manpower, or so on, like a normal province? Well, aside from letting you generate CBs, tribal land has two uses. The first is that a settled tribe may settle into their tribal land. This may be done at both the cost of monarch points, as well as at accumulated tribal development. We'll discuss tribal development more shortly. Suffice to say for now that they're a little like monarch points, effectively a pool of mana that can be used to take certain actions. Settling tribal land converts it into a normal province, generating income, manpower, and so on for the parent nation. The second use for tribal land is that upon reforming their government into a monarchy, theocracy, republic, or steppe horde, all tribal lands will turn into normal provinces at no cost. This leads to a short-term, long-term trade-off question, namely, is it worth it to spend monarch points to settle into tribal land, or to add tribal land and settle into tribal land now, if you're going to get all the tribal land for free anyway, as full provinces anyway, once you reform? Without wanting to be overly reductionist, if you're a settled tribe, then the answer is essentially always going to be no. It isn't worth it to pay monarch points to both add land that borders you, and then settle it. There are a few select provinces, such as Chitimacha here and Trinidad, where they have high enough base development that that isn't true, where you can actually generate a good return in the time before you reform. But there are only a handful of provinces in all of America with that much development, and most have much, much less. As for paying only to settle into existing tribal land, not to add new tribal land, but only to settle into existing tribal land, there are two useful rules of thumb. If the estimated years until you're reforming is 30 or more, then a base tax province of 2 or more is good. If your estimated years until reform is 50 or more, then even a 1 base tax province is strictly going to make you a profit in that time. Another feature added in Leviathan is the tribal federation mechanic, which allows New World tribes to form a federation, which is somewhat like a mini HRE. Like the HRE, there is a leader, and there are members. The leader aims to pass reforms, or advancements, that provide bonuses to all the League members, and which can ultimately, if the final reform is passed, result in them uniting into a single nation. Additionally, all the members of the Federation are called into defensive wars from outside threats. Unlike the HRE, the Federation leader can kick out members of the Federation at will, and unlike the HRE, there isn't only just one of them. There can be lots and lots of federations, and indeed there's even a Federation map mode. Diplomatic? Yeah, there we go, Federation. You can see there's a whole bunch of federations, so there's likely to be lots of them, unlike the HRE. Additionally, unlike the Federation, Federation leaders don't have a chance to change every time the leader of the nation which leads it gets a new leader. Or gets a new ruler, I should say. So as the leader here, as the leader of the Federation, when we get a new ruler, it isn't as if the Federation has a chance at getting a new leader. We stay the leader pretty much forever. Instead, the way that a Federation gets a new leader is if federal cohesion, which is somewhat analogous to the HRE's imperial authority system, so these imperial authority points are a little bit the same as our federal cohesion points. If this reaches 0, then whichever nation is the strongest in the Federation, as determined by having the greatest manpower, maximum manpower pool, becomes the new leader. Or if that was already the nation that was the leader, then the Federation is disbanded. There are 8 reforms, the final of which unifies all the nations in the Federation into a single new nation. Of these reforms, aside from the unification reform, 2 deserve further discussion: the Unified Warbands reform and the Joint Grain Stores reform. The Unified Warbands reform forces all members of a federation to be called into offensive wars by its members on non-members of the federation, turning the federation from a defensive alliance network into an offensive one, while the Joint Grain Stores reform increases the tribal development growth of all members. This makes a sensible time to talk about the tribal development mechanic itself. Tribal development is development which gets added to the capital of a nation, but which doesn't reside in that nation's capital province. So a migratory tribe takes its tribal development with it as it migrates. Aside from just floating around in the aether, tribal development in each category behaves just like true development, with tribal admin development, diplo development, and military development contributing to base tax, goods produced, and manpower, just like normal development. Additionally, tribal development is used to settle tribes into existing tribal lands, or can be settled in existing settled lands, although this is generally not worthwhile, with the exception being that you should settle all tribal development just before you click the reform button, as otherwise it disappears back into the aether from which it came. The final point to discuss is reforming. Tribes start with no institutions, and cannot dev push in order to get them. This means that as time passes, and the number of institutions they do not have accumulates, the increased tech cost will become more and more prohibitive. There are two intended paths to reforming. The first is to complete the government reform tree, any of the Tier 5 ones, and reform into the government type of your choice. With a note here that only tribes which have never settled are allowed to reform into hordes. The second is to use the third of the fourth tier reforms, trading with foreigners. This requires you border a nation which has already reformed, one which isn't tribal. In practice, this is likely to be a colonizing European, or else another tribe which has reformed faster. Using this method immediately gains all institutions present in the border province, and you reform into the same type of government as the nation which borders you has. Usually this will be a monarchy, although sometimes bordering the Dutch may result in a republic. Unlike the system from long, long ago, for reforming off of the colonizers, you cannot adopt their technology directly. Those familiar with the old system may have been led to expect as much based on this startup screen description, which specifically says, we will then adopt their technology and their institutions. In reality, this tooltip currently lies, and you only get their institutions.